All right, welcome to part 3 of the Create PT rubric quiz. All right, and so we are looking at problems 18 through 25. Now, in 18 through 25, we are simply looking at the uh, just the code segments that would be required in 3B, 3C, or 3D. All right, so that would relate to rows 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. All right, so let's take a look at question 18. All right, so consider the following code segments for a response to 3B. All right, so we have names equals empty list, def search name, names, right? Key in name for X in names, right? Does this code segment meet the minimum requirements for response to 3B? All right, and the answer is, well, this first line here does not show any data actually being stored in the list, right? So when we look at row 2, it says two program code segments, one that shows how data has been stored in a list, one that shows how the same list is being used, right? And so here we see no data is stored in this list, but we do see that the list is being used, right, as a parameter here, and then for X in names, right? So it is being used, but it is not ever shown being stored. And so we say the answer would be C. No, it only shows data from a list being used. All right, let's move on to number 19. Same question. All right, consider the following code segments. All right, scores equals empty list, right? For X in range 0 to num, score equals int app.getTextInput, enter a score, scores.append score. So we are showing the list being initialized as empty, but then scores.append score. So we are using a loop to append various numbers into the scores list. So we are showing storage, but then we're never actually using it, or at least this code segment doesn't show that. All right. And so the answer here would be B. No, it only shows data in the list being stored. Shows data being stored in a list, but never being used. All right, so that's number 19. All right, so now we're moving on to number 20, which is response 3C. So now we are looking at row 4. Includes two program code segments, one showing a student-developed procedure with at least one parameter that has an effect on the functionality of the procedure, and then one showing student-developed procedure being called. All right, so we see definition of the add list function, and then list is our parameter. So now we look down here for I in range 0 to len list. We're seeing that parameter being used, right? Total equals total plus list I, right? So now we are using that parameter within the function. And then here we see a call to the add list function, right? And so, all right, does it show student developed procedure with at least one parameter? Yes. That has an effect? Yes. One that shows where the student developed procedure is being called? Yes. So that would be the minimum to achieve row 4, right? But does it achieve row 5? Does it include sequencing, selection, and iteration? All right. So you see there is a for loop here, right? So that would be iteration. Sequencing, remember, it has more than one line of executable code. All right, but it does not have selection. There is no if or, if else or anything like that. And so we would say no, it does not meet the criteria. All right, but specifically why? Because it is missing selection, right? So the answer to number 20 is D. All right. Let's move on to 21. Same thing. Consider the following code segment as a response to 3C. All right, so take a look. We have add total list, right? And then we look here, total equals 0 for I in range 0 to 5, total equals total plus I, return total. You see that list does not ever appear in this line of code, which means what? That parameter, while it exists, it does not have an effect on the functionality of the procedure, right? Okay, and so if we look back at row 4, okay, one that shows a student developed procedure, which it is, but it does not have a parameter that has an effect. Okay, one that shows where the procedure is called. Yes, we are calling the function, so that is true. All right, so that wouldn't have even the minimum for row 4, but remember, row 4 and 5 are separate. So now let's look at row 5. Does it have sequencing, selection, and iteration? All right, so sequencing, yes, more than one line of executable code. Selection, once again, No, no selection. There's no if, but there is a loop. And so we would say for number 21, we would say C, no, it has no parameter, or the parameter is irrelevant because it is not used, which is the case. And D, no, it is a missing selection. So the answer to this one is actually C and D. Notice it did say select all that apply. So you did need to select both of those. All right. Moving on to 22. All right. Consider the following code segment once again. Def add numbers, nums. And so now does the parameter have an effect? We look len nums, nums I. So it does look like the parameter does have an effect. All right. So once again, going back to row 4, student developed procedure where it has an effect on the functionality. Yes. One showing where the student developed procedure is called. Are we calling the add numbers function? Yes. All right. So minimum for row 4. Absolutely. All right. Row 5, sequencing, selection, and iteration. All right. And so we see sequencing, more than one line of executable code. Selection, we do have an if here. There does not need to be an if else or an if and an elif. A single if is just fine. All right. And then iteration, we see a for loop here. And so it would meet the criteria for row 5. And so the answer here would be A, yes. This does meet the minimum requirements for a response to 3C. All right, let's move on to 23. Same type of thing. All right, and right away we look at this and it says, let's see, one that shows a student developed procedure, right? And so we look here and we see an on mouse press, which is not considered a student developed procedure. And so right away we would say, no, it is not a student created function. But let's take a look. Does it have the other elements? Does it have at least one parameter that has an effect? Mouse X, mouse Y, if mouse X is greater than 100. So mouse X does matter, right? And then circle is mouse X plus I times 150, mouse Y, right? So the parameters do have an effect, but it is not a student developed procedure, right? So it looks like B right now. C, right? The parameter is used, so that's not the answer, right? But then we need to look at row 5 once again. Do we have sequencing, selection, and iteration? So sequencing, more than one line of executable code. Yes. Selection, we have an if here. And iteration, we do have a for loop here. And so the answer here would be only B. No, it does not show a student-created function. All right, let's move on to 24, which would relate to row 6. Right, so we describe 2 calls to the selected procedure. Each call must pass a different argument that causes a different segment of code in the algorithm to execute. All right, so we have the draw shape function, x comma y. All right, if x is less than 250, draw this circle. All right, so draw shape 200, comma 100, draw shape 100, comma 100. All right, so are the arguments different? Okay, well, we have 200, 100, and 100, 100. Yes, the y is the same, but when you put the arguments together, right, they are considered different, right, because something has changed. All right, now, do they cause different segments of code to execute? So if x is less than 250, so 200 is less than 250, 100 is less than 250. And so that means what? That the answer would be no. The 2 calls would result in the same portion of code executing, right? And so B would be my answer for number 24. All right. And then let's go on to number 25. Consider the following code segments. Add num list, right? So we have a list here, all right, being used here and here. Add nums, right? So we see a call with 5, 8, 12, 10, and we see a call with 2, 4, 6. All right, so, all right, once again for row 6, 2 calls to the selected procedure with different arguments that cause a different segment of code to execute. So are these arguments different? Yes, very clearly. Do they cause a different segment of code to execute? So we have to look at this, right? And it says for x in range 0 to len list, if x mod 2 equals 0, total equals total plus list. So really all we're doing is adding up the total of the even numbers, right? And then if the total is greater than 20, return total, else return 20. So if we add together the even numbers here, 8, 12, and 10, right, we get a number greater than 20, so we return total. And here we add the even numbers together and we get a total of 12. okay, which is not greater than 20. And so then the else would execute and return 20. And so these two arguments do cause different segments of code to execute. And so the answer for number 25 is A. All right. And so that concludes part 3.